right. Well, Dave Hurlow, welcome to the bookshelf. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure.
I was so excited to read this. Amanda, who produces this podcast with us, recommended the book to me. And I mean, I don't even know where to start with some of the questions because I feel like you built such a massive, just a massive world. It's like, where do you begin when you're building something that is this epically unique?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think that I started the rough draft of this like 8 years ago,
Wow.
and I don't think that I realized that it was how hard into the fantasy kind of style it was gonna go. And
Yeah.
I really didn't know that when I started writing it. I was like, oh, I kind of like having a bit of a kind of a fantasy vibe, but there were certain moments I remember, like when I was doing the first draft, where I would kind of have these flashes of the sort of the strange ideas and the world building and the fantasy worlds that you're referring to, and I was like, can I do that? Like, is that? And I was like, people do that, and so I just went like as the book goes, as you experienced, it just kind of goes weirder and weirder and weirder and weirder until it's just like, okay, like this is just completely just fantasy pandemonium now. And so it surprised me too.
That's
So
so interesting because I was
yeah.
wondering if you had kind of like built out the rules of your sort of, the more magical realism first and then filled it with all these characters. But really, it started with the characters and the characters kind of took you there.
Yeah, and I think like again, I feel like it's so vague because it was 8 years ago, but I think like the other thing that I wrote before this was a collection of short stories, and I had this dream about this like old like lizard man in like a suit, and I was like I don't know what that is, but it's so weird, and I want to build a story around that. And then with Deep Sea Feline, like with the actual as you see on the cover, and I have the artwork here behind me, but
Oh,
the Deep
cool.
Sea Feline I think it was in a dream or something, because the deep sea feeling comes to Charlie in a dream early in the novel, and I feel like I dreamt it, and I was like, so I had this idea for this beautiful sort of like compassionate, connective, curious force, and then it was kind of like, okay, well, I want to set up like what is the not the opposite, but what's something that can kind of be in conflict with that. So the chaos side of things, where it sort of turns into this power balance that gets disrupted, like that that I figured out as I went, but I have definitely figured out I'm working on a new project now, and the more that I write fiction, the more I figure out that I really like to improvise. I really like to just kind of get things rolling and write fast and loose, and kind of I would way rather work with like a sloppy rough draft than have to kind of meticulously and carefully craft this like something that where I'm doing a lot more planning.
Yeah, it's like you want the clay that you can mold into something if later, as opposed to not having clay and trying to have the shape immediately.
Yeah, I would say so.
That's really cool. So I mean, do you typically have very vivid dreams? Or were
Yeah,
they unusual?
I love that question actually, and I do like so definitely for several years, and I guess around the time that I was writing the book, I started working with my dreams a lot in a sort of in a therapeutic way, and I found it to be so rich, and I do. I mean, the book isn't like that personal. It wasn't. I don't want to say that it was me trying to like work through some stuff or anything like quite like that. But I do think of art as a very cathartic thing, and definitely the things that come to me, it does in a way feel. Um, I guess it does feel kind of therapeutic, and it does feel very connected to like my unconscious life and things that come to me in dreams, and that moment that I think that all artists really treasure, where whether you're sleeping and you're half asleep and you wake up, or you're just walking down the street kind of like looking at the trees, and all of a sudden this thing jumps into your head, and you're like, yes, like that's it. And it's always, those moments are so valuable, and you really feel like, certain aspects of the artistic process are coming to you in this very beautiful, magical way that's a little bit beyond yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you feel it when you're reading it. It was interesting because I felt like, as sort of wild and wonderful as all of the fantasy elements get as the book goes on, it felt like the more that stuff expanded, the more I felt like, oh yeah, I feel like this author sees me. Do you know what I mean? Like it was interesting because it felt like there was like permission to enter that world a
Mhm.
little bit differently. Sometimes when things are really practical, it's a little bit harder to fit yourself, like shoehorn yourself into something when you're reading. And it was like, I mean, there's a huge through line of reality dissolving, which we're all dealing with in the world right now, and
Mhm.
what is real and what isn't real, and what is the truth and what isn't the truth, and where does our purpose fall within sort of this like battle of good and evil that we feel very aware of in our world right now. And it was like, passage after passage where I was like, oh wow, yeah, I feel that way, or this really resonates with how like life feels right now. And yet you're
Mhm.
like talking about, people who've crossed over to the inside of a piece of
Yeah.
art and they're furry, and you know what I mean? Like, and I was like, but I feel like I really relate to this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know what? It's really funny because you're actually one of the first people who I'm speaking to, who's actually read the book, because you're sort of an early reader of the final draft of it. So I take that as such a high compliment, and I really appreciate it. And I think that, yeah, I don't know. I really wanted to. I did really want to write something that was an invitation to people, and that was had some depth to it, but was also a lot of fun to read. And I think also like a really beautiful thing that was certainly disrupted in the pandemic, but like just this really difficult moment that we're having, as a human species, and all of these anxieties and all of that, like, I could go on, but I have become, I just love having conversations with people about, like, how are you navigating this, like, what are you meditating, are you breathing, are you exercising, like the forces of chaos are like, that's the metaphor, right? Like
Yes.
the forces of chaos are destroying us, and
Yeah.
what are we going to do, like what's the thread that you're going to find that's going to help you navigate through this as an individual, as we as a collective kind
Yeah.
of like try to
Well, even
navigate.
I feel like I can't think of what page it's on, but there's a section where you talk about how there's that there the idea of identity is kind of tied to that we have like an anchor that kind of tethers us, and yet there's
Mm,
all of this that swirls around it, and that there
mm,
is a
mm.
like a fluidity to identity, but yet there's always that like anchor that we have to find.
Yes.
Am I remembering that
Yeah.
accurately?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book a long time ago, but I think I was thinking about that passage recently. Yeah.
It's really powerful because it's what you're saying, it's like we're all coming out of this weird time. I was even thinking about how, you use birds a lot when you're in the agents of chaos sort of
Mm.
situation. And I was like, oh, I wonder if that relates to like tweets, like Twitter, like the actual
Oh,
thing of,
wow.
like, because it felt like, that ah, that they were that these birds in this in the pelican sort of god land is they're
Mm,
tearing people apart with divisiveness and sort of pitting people against each other and
mm, mm.
planting these ideas of lies. And I was like, oh, it's like these constant little like tweets in the background of our
Honestly,
existence.
that was not intentional, but I love that you made that connection. And yeah, I mean, I think that, again, it is quite metaphorical, and the chaos and the birds, and sort of what is the thing that is coming out of this chaotic, like, bird world, and what is the thing that's emanating from this deep sea feline world, like that is sort of the metaphor, this metaphorical thing, sort of for the difficult position we're in. But to go back to the thing about the anchor, I don't know. I don't know where this answer is going to go, but the reason that I was thinking about it recently is that I've gotten really into Buddhist meditation, in the past 8 years as well. And there are so many of these really wild, paradoxical things that you encounter when you're trying to understand
Yeah.
the philosophy, and then you're meditating and you're sort of having experiences that are sort of reinforcing things and sometimes making things more confusing. But the thing in Buddhism is there is this idea of no self,
Mm,
of, of no self. And on the one hand, it's true, but on the other hand, there is kind of a self, And it's
yeah.
like at the end of your meditation when you've been vibrating, with all this stuff, and you're sort of in this very strange space, and you sort of experience yourself as, you know, just kind of feelings and vibrations and sensations, and then you kind of pull yourself back together, and you get up and you like make dinner, and you have a
Right.
difficult conversation with your mom. And I think that like it's so attractive at first when you're like, yeah, there's no self, like this stuff is so cool. But then you realize that like there also is a self, and it is that anchor where it's like you can go really far out there, in certain experiences. But but there also is that sort of self that you come back to. So again, I don't know, like I just that's why I was thinking
Well,
about
I
it.
mean,
And
it's interesting because it's like, listen, I have a friend who has two sets of twins. And so it was, and I was there, I got to come and visit, like, I think it was like the day after she had her first set of twins.
Mhm.
And it was incredible to see that, like, I mean, these two little kids came out at the same time, with the same body, with the same parents, with the same, DNA, and yet
Mhm.
their personalities, you could see it just in the way they like took a bottle or the way that they responded to certain things. And then, 14 years later, you still see the thread of those personalities in how they
Mhm.
navigate the world. And it's hard to deny that there is some sort of, like you said, anchored self, that
Mhm.
there is a fluidity where we can keep, adding, gaining, experiencing, moving around, but like there's something that's in there that feels like it's
Yeah.
a core
I,
thing.
I think that one of the reasons that, and again, like I like Buddhism, but I think there's a lot of different flavors of spirituality, and there's a lot of ways to find a really nice space where you can find a little bit more flexibility in terms of the self, and sort of kind of soften the ego a little bit. And I think that where we're at, and in this moment, I feel like the thinking mind and that reinforcing the self and reinforcing the ego is so strong that there is people are really thirsty for spiritual experiences and for connectivity and for art and for things that take you beyond
Yes.
yourself. So it's like it might be a little bit like it's a little bit over the top, or like maybe going a little bit too far to say like there is absolutely no self. But I think that we've gone so far in the direction of the thinking mind and the egoic self that it is like a nice course correction to be like, let's
Yeah, yeah,
just
we're
let's
trying to
loosen
swing
up a
the
little
pendulum
bit,
back a
like
little bit.
yeah, exactly.
Well, and you're bringing up something else that I really, really loved about the novel, which is how much you incorporate music and art into the
Mm,
storytelling, and how I mean, the music and the opera in this feels like it's a character in itself. I mean, obviously you start with someone composing an opera, you end with someone, with this group of people actually performing the opera, and realizing that there is this like manifestation of some sort of balance that comes from the performance of it. But it's so cool. I don't know that I've ever read anything where like the healing force was
right.
physically music, and you're also a
Yeah,
musician, right? Like I think you have
that's
an
right.
album coming out soon, another album coming out soon,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, it actually is my, so it's the I the thing that's coming out is an EP, and it's the first music that I started writing it before the pandemic, but then in the pandemic, I recorded the songs, and then a friend of mine helped me to sort of make it, like at a professional level versus my home demos. And now it's a really great situation because I have some friends who are willing to put together a band. So we're putting together a band. The EP will be coming out shortly, but it is the first music that I've ever written
Oh, I didn't
myself.
realize that. Okay.
Yeah. So then I'll go back and just to speak about the music piece of it a little bit. The funny thing about that is that um, I was in a band from the time that I was in my late teens through all of my 20s. and then I made a decision to leave the band, and I moved from the west end of Toronto to the east end of Toronto, and I was like, I'm going to be a writer now, and I'm going to undergo this very serious kind of solitary, artistic journey. And the funny thing was is that I just am so obsessed with music that I left the music scene, I left my band, and then I started writing this novel, and all I wanted to do was like make it all about
Music.
music. And then as soon as I was done writing the novel, I want to make some music. So, I really it's kind of a funny thing because I did really write this novel in such a bubble, and like I don't have a lot of writer friends. I have a couple, but I don't really workshop my stuff with people. I'm not in community with writers. I don't go to a lot of literary events. And in a lot of ways, I actually still feel like I have like I'm more of a resonance with the musical community than I do with the literary community, in certain ways. So it was, yeah, it was just it was kind of a funny. I just think about this sort of. There's almost there's a bit of comedy to that like I left music, but I just couldn't quite like leave music alone.
You can't get it, you can't remove that from your soul. I mean, we have a lot of music in our family too. My dad was a music teacher for his career, and my mom taught music with him, and then my brother taught music, and we played instruments. And I just feel like, whether I'm acting or directing, I feel like there's no kind of removing the fact that that's in me. So it makes sense to me that, you make this transition to writing, but then also still have such a strong tie to the music. But I mean, even that felt metaphorically really profound to me. It was just like opera as the choice is,
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, well, because I mean, listen, it makes so much sense. You say at one point something about, oh gosh, who's the character who says it? I have it here. Uh, the Artemis Willamurray. Am I saying that right?
Artemis, that, yeah, her name is, I grabbed it. It's a small Ontario town that I would always go past the sign, and it would say like West Gwillimbury, and I was like, I want to use that somehow.
It's such a great name.
Yeah.
But she says, she says your family history reads like a Greek tragedy. So obviously
Mm,
opera matches Greek tragedy
mm,
in a right way,
yeah.
but like it is also kind of a dying art, right? Like it's not something that
Mhm.
I can't imagine like kids who watch YouTube all day being like, yeah, I'm gonna go watch an opera. And yet
Yeah.
the sort of melodrama of the way an opera is told, or the sort of, Greek tragedy influences of opera feel
Mhm.
very relevant to what the world is going through right now. And so it was
Yeah.
like such an interesting choice, I felt like, to kind of be reviving something that in a way, like it feels like an art form that has like one foot in the grave, and yet it's still such a powerfully resonant idea in terms of how it relates to what's happening right now.
Yeah, yeah. The opera thing, I think that there were a few different ways that ended up entering the book. I think that like the one of the biggest things, and it's a very kind of like I don't want to say lazy, but it's not that interesting. It's just that opera is it's so epic and it's so dramatic, and Toronto has this great Canadian opera company in the Four Seasons Center that's like right downtown, and I just thought it would be really fun. There would be some really big, flashy kind of brushstrokes in the story to just set up this sort of epic. And people who love opera are obsessed with opera and this kind of idea of like a lost masterpiece, and
Yeah.
people are just, the opera fanatics are like, and it's funny because I don't like, I had to interview people in the opera world because I'm not that into opera, but I wanted to learn about it and I thought it would be a really cool thing to nest into the novel. But yeah, like people get really really excited about it, and that's not the opera. I've had some interesting experiences at the opera. It's not where I get the catharsis of art is like is happens for me maybe in different scenarios, but so that was one aspect of it, is just that it's so epic, and it is a really good metaphor for like a very grand detailed art form that requires a lot of patience and attention. in our sort of culture, with cultural decay, and people don't have the time to watch, a long opera. But the other reason I think, which was, this is more coincidental and it's more kind of funny to me, is that I went to high school with a guy named Rob Gletto, and he's actually he's like a fairly like well-known opera singer. And I just remember, like, I found out that he was singing like at the Canadian Opera Company at the Four Seasons Center, and I went to a show, and I just thought it was so weird that a guy that I went to high school with, I was like, that's his life, that's what he does. Like, he's an opera singer, and I was like, what would that look like? So the idea of the character of Greg was kind of like, I just started imagining what would life be like if a guy who was my age, I'm 38 now, like had gone into the opera at a young age, and though that had been the water that he'd been swimming in for whatever 18 years.
I'm so excited to share that our podcast is brought to you in partnership with Seed. As many of you know, I am a huge advocate of this incredible company and their DSO1 Daily Symbiotic, which I have taken every day for years. DSO1 is a 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic formulated with 24 clinically and scientifically studied strains for whole body benefits, including gut, skin, and heart health. I started taking Seed daily because I love how seriously they are about their science. It's formulated based on robust clinical and mechanistic research with probiotic strains. And super good news, there's no refrigeration necessary. Seed's patented capsule and capsule design safeguards probiotics through digestion for delivery of an average of 100% of their starting dose to your colon. I also love Seed's commitment to environmental health. They have developed probiotics for honeybees, coral reefs, and have created new standards in sustainable packaging. Your first month of Seed includes a refillable glass jar and complimentary vial for on the go, and refills arrive each month in a compostable bio pouch. For our listeners, Seed is offering 25% off your first order. Go to seed.com/Jen's Bookshelf. Use code Jen's Bookshelf for 25% off your first order of Seed.
Interesting, because it's like I really relate to the way you're talking about your process, because I feel like, especially when I'm directing, everything feels so collected. It's like you can't control the things you interact in any given day. It's like a commercial
Mm,
might give you an idea, or a book that's sitting on a table at the dentist's office might give you an idea, or
mm,
someone sends you a photo and you're like, oh, that's cool framing, or it's like, it's so weird how there's like nothing is exactly the thing that you use, but there's like always this little like nudge that like starts pushing you toward certain things. And I feel like that sounds kind of similar to how you're like talking about kind of collecting these ideas that started to turn into
yeah.
the story that it is.
I'm really happy that you said that, and I love what you said, because again, I learned a lot about myself as an artist through the writing process of this novel. And one thing that I learned, it was funny, like because as I said, like I moved from the West End to the East End of Toronto. Toronto, the East End is a much quieter place, and it's like seems like a place that a writer would live. And I was like, I'm going to go into this like almost monastic state, and I'm going to write this book. And it ended up being kind of a recipe for anxiety, because I had sort of cut myself off in certain ways from things in my life. And what I realized is that what works really well for me is actually having a lot going on and seeing my friends a lot and going out and talking to people. And when I'm writing, like I'm not very I seem to be able to produce a decent amount of writing, but I'm not that strict with myself. I only usually write for maybe 2 hours at a stretch. And I spend a lot of time just out in the world, talking to people. I work part time at a cafe. I teach creative writing through a nonprofit in Toronto public schools. And that energy, like of going out and collecting all these ideas and kind of collecting that energy, and then just carving out 2 hours to sit down, and then I feel like I'm charged with all of these little things that I've seen and little moments that I've shared with people, and I can kind of shoot that right into the manuscript. And I remember there's a really great Canadian novelist named Andre Alexis. He wrote a book called I think it's called, I'm gonna say the number right. It's like 15 dogs, and it's about these dogs. It's like sort of all these dogs in Toronto, and you get to see what it would be like to be a dog, and it's really cool. But he had I saw him speak one time, and he was like, "Yeah, I wrote this book, and I went to my friend's like husky farm like somewhere, and like it was just me and the huskies, and I was completely alone, and I would write for like 8 hours a day. And I was just like,
Wow.
I would have a full blown mental breakdown if I tried to do that. Like, I have learned that it's interesting to see that for some people, they can just, they have their idea for their novel and they can just go somewhere and completely shut themselves away and bang out a novel. And for me, that's like the worst thing in the world, where it's a lot healthier for me to have a lot of movement and a lot of um, yeah, a lot of socializing and a lot of being out in the
It's
world.
amazing though that like, in reading it, there feels to be such a clear intentionality to the structure. So
Mm.
even though,
Mhm.
I'm hearing that your process is that it feels to me like you like let the characters carry you through the story, that it's almost like they're living for you a little bit and you're
Mhm.
listening to them. But what's the process once you kind of get that first draft out, and like is there a tremendous amount of kind of, rejiggering and reworking and refining, or did you feel like that arc presented itself and then it wasn't that far from where you ended up?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Also, and I think that I would imagine that it's the case for a lot of authors and novelists in particular, like again, I had 8 years, from the time I started the first draft to now, and um and I think the first draft, I was like, once I figured out it was fantasy, and I'm a big fan of Haruki Murakami and some of his novels, like
It's so interesting because
1QA4 is
my
like,
review, I mean, literally the first line of my review of Deep Sea Feline is like, he has got to love Murakami. Like,
yeah, I'm not hiding it. I'm not hiding it for sure. But and Murakami also works beautifully with music. But I was gonna say, like, some of his books, like the Wind Up Bird Chronicles and 1Q84, are these long, long, long books. And then if you look at a lot of fantasy novels, they're very long. And so I sort of thought, I really like long books. I'm gonna write a really long book. And so there were certain sections where I would really kind of like stretch it out and vamp on it. And so the first draft was really, really, really long.
oh, interesting.
And I remember there was an agent who read it a few years ago, who's not my current agent, but he was great and he was really helpful. And the draft was maybe 140,000 words, and he was like, this is a great book. You're a good writer. I'm not going to take this on right now, but if you want to sell it, I'm going to recommend that you cut 50,000 words
Wow.
of the book. And so, and at first I kind of just, kind of slumped away in defeat and was like, I don't know if I can do that. But then I turned around and I found the 50,000 words to cut, and it really streamlined it. And yeah, so there was, I mean, that whole process. And again, I think the thing is, the other thing about being a first time novelist is, like, you do go a bit crazy because you don't have I didn't have you don't have an agent, you don't have a publisher, so you sort of have this thing that you're working on, and you don't know if it's good or not, or people are going to like it. So the thing that I find really interesting is now, like, I'm working on a new project, and it's like I have an agent, like I have people who are right there for me to turn to and say, like, what do you think of this draft? So like that first novel in that 8 year stretch of like just being totally solo and not having anyone on your team, it's a very unique position to be in, and it definitely made for some pretty serious moments of anxiety, um, and
It's a huge commitment to be like, I'm gonna write a novel and I have no idea if anyone's gonna like it.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Huge. It's not like, I mean, it's not like a script, or I mean, even just a script is a lot of a big commitment, but like it seems like such an unbelievable undertaking, with no sense of what the end result
yeah.
might be.
Well, the thing that I think is so funny about that too is that, like, again, as I was saying, I'm not that tuned into the literary community. So when I was like, I'm gonna write a book, I was like, I bet nobody's trying to write books these days. I bet I'm so like unique and special that I'm trying to write a book. But like, I feel like it's such a crazy thing to do, to put all that work and put yourself into a book and then have to submit it to agents and try to find an agent and find a publisher. But there are a lot of people doing it,
Yeah.
and it's like wow, I can't. I'm so it's so inspiring that people are compelled to do that, and yeah, it's really wild to me, like all the people out there who are writing their magnum opuses or whatever,
Yeah.
and a lot of those are never going to see the light of day, but people are doing it.
Yeah, and it's also just like, who are the gatekeepers? It's like, because I've heard people say before, just like, where are the great classic novels of our time?
Mm,
And at one point, before I was sort of doing this book club and sort of diving into the world of publishing and having a sense of what was going on a little bit more, like what you're talking about just now, I was like, I think they're like writing video games. Like I was like you, I was thinking, well, maybe not as many people are writing books. But I
mhm.
also think that there's just less things actually being published. There's probably just as many people writing things, and then it's like, who are the gatekeepers, and who are the tastemakers and the people deciding that something is worth publishing or something is worth promoting. And I wonder how many great classic novels never get published just because they're not in vogue with the taste of the time, or I don't know.
Yeah,
It's an
yeah,
interesting thing to wonder what that graveyard is somewhere.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I found actually really reassuring is that I went down to Word on the Street, which is a big literary festival in Toronto that happens every summer, and I went down to meet the publishers at Latitude 46 who are putting the book out. And it was so vibrant. There were so many people there. There were a lot of young people there, and there were all of these tents of independent publishing companies.
Wow.
And people were curious and buying a lot of books, and there were young people there who were like just coming up to the tables of small indie publishers and just saying like, hey, tell me about this book, like
Wow.
what is it? And the author or the publisher would say, oh, it's this and that or the other book, and people would say, that sounds cool, I'll buy it. And I was like, wow, people are still, like people still love to read, people still love literature. And so yeah, on the one hand, there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, um, they can't get past the gatekeepers. And I suppose there's certain trends and fashions in within the publishing world that sort of dictates what people want to buy and what people don't want to buy. But it was very I felt yeah, I got the warm fuzzies from seeing
Yeah.
all
It's
these people
interesting
out
because we're
supporting.
we're finding that as well. Like, we've worked a lot with $2 Radio, which is an independent publisher. It just has turned out that we've interviewed a lot of their authors.
Mhm.
And in talking to them, they were saying a very similar thing. They were saying, this independent space, it's actually really supportive. It's like that they have other friends who are other independent producers, where sometimes they're like, oh, we got this great novel, but it doesn't really fit our brand, but we'll send it to this guy, and maybe they want to do it, and he'll send it to this woman, and maybe they'll want to do it. And that there's this sort of collective energy of like wanting to uplift the great writing that's going on. And
Yeah,
I was like, what a
yeah,
cool
yeah,
thing, because you don't
exactly.
hear about that in most businesses, that
No, I feel
that
like in
kind of
certain
collaboration.
yeah, like I remember in BoJack Horseman, there was like I don't know if you watched that show, but there was like I think Patton Oswalt voiced this like kind of beaten down, depressing penguin that was like the Penguin Random House penguin, and he was sort of the butt of all these jokes of like, oh, the lights are out and now like the building's been sold, and like these all these jokes kind of about the detriment of the publishing industry. Again, I don't know anything about the financials of it, but it is cool to see that actually in many ways, like reading culture and book culture is thriving. And just to go back to the book too, like that goes along with opera of like reading a book, turning your phone off and sitting and reading a book for an hour. It's almost become this like radical, like rebellious act in
I know.
this, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
it's like, and so it does make sense to me why Gen Z folks and younger folks would be drawn to it as kind of an antidote to this chaotic, like all these things coming at you and you can't figure out what's going on. And you pick up a book and it's like, oh, it's a challenge to
Yeah.
maintain your attention sometimes, but there is something so um, calming and so beautiful about connecting with something in that deeper way.
As many of you know, I am obsessed with Frida Salvador shoes, and I am so excited to say that this episode is brought to you by Frida Salvador. Style is a part of all of us. It's the first way we express ourselves in the morning, and it's the first impression we give to those around us. But finding that right piece that's both comfortable and expresses your individual style takes time. And that's why I wanted to introduce you to my favorite brand, Frida Salvador, designed in California by my friends Christina and Megan. They are inspired by individual style, and they're on a mission to build community from the ground up. I cannot tell you how many times when I'm wearing these shoes, someone comes up to me and goes, "Look, I'm wearing them too. Aren't they so amazing? Isn't it incredible how comfortable they are?" This shoe really has a community around it. They are the coolest shoes and accessories handcrafted by artisans in Spain and El Salvador with the highest quality Italian leathers they can find. I love these styles because they are classic but reimagined with statement details. And I also trust Frida to deliver impeccably made pieces that will be in my closet forever. I love them. I wear them almost every day. I highly recommend you check out their latest collection, and I will give you 15% off with my code Jen's Bookshelf. Just visit fridasalvador.com for 15% off with the code Jen's Bookshelf.
I feel like too that I feel like I wish I had saved these articles back in the day, but I remember coming across articles that talked about how um that you just learn so much about empathy by reading. And I think that
Mhm.
to me that really resonates just because, when I was a kid, I grew up in a very sort of safe suburb and I was very lucky, I was like born into a very good life. But I was always so curious and I always wanted to know about the world and I want to understand what's going on outside of this little bubble that I was growing up in, and books were how I did that. Books were
Mhm.
where I learned about all sorts of things. Books were where I felt like, oh, maybe I'm not so alone in the world because these characters are going
Mhm.
through things or having thoughts like mine, and especially in a time, as we were talking about earlier, where things are very chaotic and we are losing a little sense of our human empathy DNA. It's,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it is exciting to see that people are still, doing this thing of this rebellious thing, as you said, and going back and being like, we're gonna read a book. It's like, yes, good. I do want to return to a couple things in the actual novel, though. We
Sure,
can
sure.
talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
we can come back to this too. But I was one of the things I was very curious about was just in how you established the two different sort of immortal gods of like, the
Mm-hmm.
pelican chaos and sort of destruction, and then the deep sea feline of like compassion and empathy and all that. Is
Hmm.
that based in any kind of mythology, or was that sort of your own mythology that you invented for the structure of this book?
Yeah, so as I was saying, the deep sea feline piece of it kind of came to me in a dream, and and that I really knew what it was immediately. And then the pelican, actually, I think it's in the basement. I don't think it's in my office right now, but I have a friend of mine is like not even she I don't think she shows her work on exhibition, but she does beautiful pencil line drawings of animals. And for
Oh,
a long time I had this pelican that was hanging in my bedroom, and it was really the way she drew it was really unique. And I think like literally like when I was writing the book it was on my wall, and when I had to describe the pelican I would just look at it and be like, okay, like this is kind of what I'm seeing. And I don't know, like it. So no, like that one, the Pelican too. And again, like these funny things where you look back and you can sort of find these meanings that you didn't even originally intend. But I think it's interesting that the Pelican has this huge mouth that it can that
yes.
and it's kind of this thing of like there's a really great in Buddhism, there's this great a metaphor that is in the realm of the hungry ghost, and I might refer to the birds in the pelican world as hungry ghosts
Mm,
at certain times, and I think it's that they're sort of these ghosts, and they're big, huge, kind of plump ghosts, and they have these tiny little mouths, and they can't get enough food, you know.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Yeah, yeah, and also actually, and to go to into the themes of mental illness and addictions. There's a wonderful book by a Canadian doctor named Gabor Mate. I don't know if you're familiar with any of his stuff, but it's called. He takes the metaphor. It's called "In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts," and it talks about his decade being a resident doctor at a shelter for people who in Vancouver who are very addicted to
Wow. Yeah.
drugs. But so anyway, that's a big kind of tangent. But the thing about the big mouth was just that like that sort of relentless hunger of just never being satisfied, always kind of moving um, uh, from one thing to the next without having any mindfulness, without ever sort of slowing down and kind of really taking stock of things. So those, yeah, so it did kind of come together where I was sort of just inventing this stuff as I went along. And then, but it was kind of cool because the one place where I did dig into some mythology was with the actual opera, um, written by the I think Luca Lampo. There's so many names, and he's originally Finnish. And I looked up, I looked to see if there was any kind of Scandinavian Finnish mythology, and it was really fun because I found all this really cool stuff. There is a Finnish book of mythology called the Kalevala, and I went through a lot of those kind of folk stories, mythological folk stories. But then I started blending them with like the Bluebeard
Oh, yeah.
fairy tale, which is
Yeah.
such a cool. That's one of my favorite sort of folk tales, fairy tales, what have you. And so again, like I really love. I have a weird kind of brain, and I like to just take disparate things and blend them together. So then it got into sort of matching up some of the mythology that was just coming out of my brain with things that you see in European opera and sort of I guess Finnish mythology. Like I just sort of took a deep dive into it and used what I could.
It's so cool. I mean, I also loved the way that you kind of tease out how much we understand about those two sides of things, because initially the pelican is very manipulative and is lying in a way
Mhm.
that is so seductive, right? And like that too
Mhm.
felt very relevant, where, here we have a protagonist who's trying so hard to do the right thing and thinks that they're
Mhm.
doing the right thing and yet doesn't realize that they've been lied to, and that they're
Mhm.
now like opening this chaotic realm because of their believing a lie. And again, like, this is just, I feel like, it depends on what newspaper you open on any given day, or what news
Right, right, right.
program someone watches, or it really it was like, I don't know, I felt like I was blown away by how you were able to make it such a fun read. It was like, it's so fun and it's so sort of decadent in a certain way, and
Yeah.
yet is dealing with really heavy stuff. Like,
Mhm.
but the heavy stuff didn't feel arduous because you packaged it in this sort of
Yeah.
joy,
Yeah.
and on all of the art and all of the inspiration and all of the relationships and all these people, that Sophie and Charles and Charlie and Greg all feel so real, and their anxieties and
Mhm.
their limitations feel so relatable, and yet like portals are opening and you're like, yeah, of course
Yeah,
portals.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like,
Yeah. Well, again, I really do want to say thank you so much. I really take that as such a high compliment. And I don't know where I saw this, but somewhere it was like write the book that you would want to read.
yeah,
And I really did that. Like I really was like, I want to read a book that's fun, but that kind of like that also like has some sort of philosophical and emotional oomph to it.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad again, having not spoken to how many people have read, thank you very much. And I'm really glad that that was your experience reading it. And yeah, just going back to what you were saying about the sort of, the part where the pelican god is sort of tricks Charlie, the main character, and has sort of is lied to him. One thing that for some reason became important to me as I was writing it was this idea that like the the deep sea feline and the pelican, they don't have an agenda in the way that humans would have an agenda.
Huh. Okay.
And I think one of the reasons is, again, I was kind of uh, like learning about spirituality and kind of looking at Western religious institutions and beliefs versus more kind of Eastern, Hinduism and Buddhism and those kinds of things. And what I found is that we really like to give our gods these very human agendas.
Yeah.
And what I thought was really interesting to explore was like these gods, like maybe they're operating on a whole on a, they're part of this cosmic energy, and humans are kind of a means to an end or something, but they don't really give a shit about the dramas of these humans, and they're exerting their forces in a very natural way where like I feel like the pelican comes off as evil, but he's not supposed to be evil. It's just supposed to be different sides of the same coin sort of exerting,
Yeah.
a force against each other. But like it was this kind of cool thing where, because humans have been drawn into this struggle between these two, whatever you want to call them, yeah, like ancient mythological gods or something, like it was always this idea of like they're kind of throwing their force into the human arena, and that's expressing itself in a very human way. But I think even when eventually one of the characters meets, the deep sea feline, they have this whole experience where they think that they're having a conversation with her, but then it turns out that she sort of just like sent vibes at him, and then that was sort of a hallucination that
Yeah.
sort of was cooked up in his head.
It's just occurring to me as you're saying this too, is like, I feel like you do really delineate between the human characters and then these immortal, godlike characters. And the truth is, the two sides of the coin of the empathy and the feline versus like the sort of chaos and the endless hunger of the pelican, um,
Mm-hmm.
those are immortal concepts, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like, conceptually, y- human ability to have compassion and empathy and all those things, and then also human greed and insatiable need and selfishness, like those are immortal themes that just keep circling around each other historically from the beginning of time, probably before there were even humans. I mean, it's circling
Yeah,
around each other when there were dinosaurs on the planet.
sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's something really interesting about, like, it hadn't occurred to me while I was reading it, but just as you were saying all that, it just occurred to me that like it is interesting that there is that delineation of like this is what is immortal, and then these mere humans have to wrestle with these immortal themes over and over and over again, and sometimes one wins
Yeah,
and sometimes
yeah.
the other wins, and it's yeah, I mean, again, this is where I'm like so blown away by your process being so intuitive, because it feels, when you start to peel back the layers of what's going on, it feels so intentional and it feels so carefully plotted. And
Mm.
yet it's really inspiring to hear that your process with all these characters and with the plot was like such an intuitive experience. Um,
Yeah, you know what? I just want to. It's funny because I was at her book launch the other day, and I have a close friend of mine. I have her book right here, Harriet Lai, and this is her new book, Let It Destroy You. But she's a very close friend of mine, and she said something once that blew my mind, and I loved it, and it really kind of goes straight to the heart of what you just said. And she said, "I love doing the second draft of my novel. I love doing the second draft of a novel because I'm gonna like butcher. I'm sure she said it like more in a more profound way than this, but it was something along the lines of like, I love doing a second draft. It helps me understand why I wrote what I wrote in the first place."
oh wow.
And I really felt that because I think that the more I don't know, like I can't know what goes on in other people's processes, but I feel like sometimes like writers that I really love and musicians that I really love, there's something in their work where I can I can feel that that they just let it happen and that they kept surprising themselves, and
Mm,
that at some point you have to turn around and mold it into something. You don't have to, but if you want to, if you want to get it out there,
yeah.
you got to kind of sculpt it and put a bit of a finish on it. And um but I do have this feeling that yeah, there is this intuitive way to kind of like let go to some degree and let it happen, and then you can turn around and say, what the hell was it? Why did I write this? Why did I write this weird story? What was I trying to say? And again, for me, that this process of writing this first novel, and I'm so glad, that it's behind me now, and I can have the benefit of what I learned from
Sure.
writing and be in the process of writing a second novel where I can trust the process a lot more. Um, but yeah, I mean, it seems to me like there is a real beauty to kind of fumbling your way through it and trusting, and then looking back on it and being like, oh my God, like, and even like, I'm not saying this in an egotistical way, but like, there were moments where I was like, oh my God, I didn't mean to do that. That's fucking brilliant, like, and I loved that. That was part of the editing process that I really loved. And I mean, I guess it's okay to be a fan of yourself. Like
I mean, so I mean, you better be. You got to put
yeah,
your
I
head on the
guess
pillow at
so.
night. You
I
have to
know.
believe in what you're putting out there.
Well, yeah, but we have such a tendency to sort of, to sort of um, diminish sometimes, I think, our accomplishments in our culture. But
Yes.
I did love that of reading back sometimes, and like just that moment where I would completely forget that I had written something, and I would burst out laughing in a cafe reading my own
That's amazing.
or something, or like, and then but then to what you're saying, like, I don't think that I realized that I was setting up this kind of like this epic metaphor, for a lot of what we're dealing with in our human civilization right now, which even sounds very grand and highfalutin to say it,
Sure. But it's
but
also,
but then
but
look.
it's so deeply impacting all of us on a daily basis that if you're operating from an intuitive place, it's almost like how could you not be
Yeah,
expressing that? Because it's consumed all of us. It's collectively consumed all of us, and everybody's reaction to it is different, and everybody's digestion of it is different. But like, it does make sense that in allowing yourself to have the space to just be intuitive and let things kind of come to you as they come to you, and as you were saying earlier, kind of fumble through at times before refining things, like, of course, I mean, of course that's all there. That's life right now.
yeah. Yeah. I think the only times where I think that there's a couple of interludes where it goes more into what it means that these chaotic forces are exerting themselves over the city of Toronto, and I do get into, I guess, like maybe pinpointing or hyperbolizing some cultural trends that I find distasteful, and I did get a little bit worked up, I think, like writing those, and was like, and it's funny because like I'm addicted to my phone sometimes. Like, we order stuff from Amazon, like, I'm part of it too, and I'm falling into the same pitfalls that everyone else is falling into. So, there's some hypocrisy there, but then I just get so mad about it, and I'm like, oh man, like, you know it's so it's so stressful, and it's such a wild experience being a human in a big city in whatever we're calling it, late capitalism, post COVID, you know
Yeah.
climate change apocalypse, like whatever,
Oh,
like it's just
oh
like Jesus
God.
Christ, sorry to go
No,
there.
no,
So
I mean, like I said, there's no, you can't evade these topics right
yeah,
now, it's just, it's everywhere. It's like, we're, no matter where you live and no matter what's going on, the weather is weird, and climate things are weird, and politics are
yeah,
complicated, and everybody has a megaphone for their thoughts, with social media,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
it's a world that feels so, it just feels so divided, and it also feels overwhelming, I think. This is something I think about a lot, where it's like,
mhm,
we're not built to take on the whole world's problems. No,
mhm,
no,
yeah,
I don't think any one human being, just as much as, like, and I've said this a lot about, like, like fame and things like that. It's like we're not built for that. You're not built for that much attention coming at one person's body and soul. Like it's
For
just we're
sure.
not built for it. So just collectively as humans, I don't think we're built to absorb the tragedies or the successes of
Yeah.
the entire world in any given day. And yet we are now connected to the whole world in a way where it's not like, oh, I live in this small town and I'm just dealing with, the fire that happened a week ago and so's son died of whatever, and the grocery store
Mhm.
ran out of blah blah blah. And it's like that there was a finite amount of problems and a finite amount of quote unquote tragedies that a town would have to absorb on any
Mhm.
given day.
Yeah.
Now there's no escaping that everyone everywhere knows every tragedy and knows every huge thing that's going on. And we don't have the bandwidth to absorb all of that, So I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of the divisiveness becomes powerful, right? Is that we're always overwhelmed and we're always exhausted because we don't have the bandwidth for that. So all it takes is that one tweet or that one post or that one person saying such and such, or that just tips you over, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm glad now that I feel vindicated in steering us into that territory because that was so beautifully ranted. Um, uh, and yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think like for the characters in the book, and especially for the sort of the disenfranchised and the ones who are dealing with mental illness, part of it was saying like the weather like that we live in is for people who are having a hard time, like it's so hard now. There's so many. I think of it as downward. There's so much downward pressure on
Yeah.
everybody, psychic downward pressure. And so for the characters, that lives in the book in metaphor and so forth. But yeah, to what you're saying, like I've struggled with anxiety a fair bit in the past decade, and it's funny because like I remember at one point I would say like, oh, I don't really follow the news because it's just too much and it makes me anxious. And there was a time where that was unfashionable to say, and people would say
Yeah.
like, well, what do you mean? Like, how you have to, it's your responsibility to keep yourself up to date on what's going on in the world. And then now, people would be saying, "Oh, this, do you see what's going on in the Ukraine? You hear about the climate thing. You hear about the political thing." And I'm just like, yeah, sometimes I'll catch snippets of the news on the CBC on our public radio up here, but I don't really follow the news. And it's actually and people be like, "Oh, that's so great. It's like fashionable now." Like
Yeah.
not to follow the news, and
Because
I'm
following the
like,
news has
listen,
been
like
killing
I
us.
wasn't following the news before it was cool, like, and I'm being a little bit glib about it, and I'm not saying I don't want to stick my head in the sand and completely not be aware of what's going on, but yeah, I do think it's really hard, and I don't think that I know. I don't think that I know the answer. Like I don't know what the right way to be is in that regard because I do think that it's great to to be up to date on what's going on in the world, but if you're too open to it, it can really mess your nervous system up, mess your brain up.
Right. And
And
we don't know what's true anymore. It's you don't know what lens through which someone's reporting something, and you don't know, what bias someone has when they're collecting information. And, so it's like again, this is why the pelican lying was such a powerful metaphor, I felt like, in your story, because you know, that could be a metaphor for anything. It could be the news outlet that you've always trusted, that
right,
you thought really fact checked things or whatever, and you don't know the sub agenda that is going on and why they're trying to steer you a certain direction, and it's like, um, I don't know. It's really interesting, and I'm trying to think who I was having this conversation with recently, but we were having a conversation about how it's such a tiny percentage of the population that has power and money in the world. If you like just looked at the whole world, and let's say it's 0.1% or something.
uh,
And for the people who hang on to that 0.1%, their ultimate goal, no matter what their politics are, it doesn't matter which, left, right, super far, whatever direction you want to go, they have to make sure that the 99.9% don't realize that if they banded together, that they would be way more powerful than 0.1%. And how do you do that? You keep them divided. right? And so whether
Right.
it's a conscious decision or not, I'm sure for some people it's a conscious decision, some people it's not. It's like we're now in this like uh I don't know, phase of humanity where we are we're constantly being influenced to be divided. And it doesn't even matter how you divide people. And again, that felt very present in the storytelling. And then it also felt really powerful that this group of people, through performing the opera, they might not
Right.
be 99.9% of the population, but it was like a bigger group that came together and realized if we collectively create something together, we can be more powerful than the problem.
Right.
And
Yeah.
to me, I'm always looking for like, how do we as artists, and this is something I have said before, but it's like, how do we start dreaming up a possible positive future? Because it's kind of on the artists of the world to do that. Because if we don't dream it up, it's not going to happen. It's like
Right.
we imitate what we see. It's like you see a James Bond movie and everybody goes and buys the new car that he drives. And then, you we put a bunch of apocalyptic stories in the world and then we start manifesting an apocalypse. Like, it's like we we have to as artists go like, how do we present ideas that are like, hang on, what is actually the solution, not just the problem? And I think that's
Right.
also what I got very excited about reading your novel, was that I felt like without it being preachy or like heavy-handed in any way, there
Mhm.
was this collective movement of creating something together that was more powerful than the problem, and ultimately started to be a movement forward, and I crave that in other literature and in other sort of artistic endeavors. It's like I feel like a lot of times we only present the problem and we don't,
Right. Yeah.
you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that the first place that my brain goes, I mentioned it earlier, but again, it's something that I'm so happy that I am involved with, is this really amazing Toronto nonprofit Story Planet that we do workshops in the Toronto public school system. And like one of the things, so we are, and it is a lot of collaborative story making with the class and coming up with characters, coming up with stories together, and talking to kids about creativity. And a lot of the time, this is in low income neighborhoods where people are struggling with a lot of issues, and racialized communities, and it's sort of encouraging them sometimes to use creativity in this way of saying, this is what we have, this is what's happening. Creativity can be used as something to say, what could we create that would be different than what this is. And literally, in during the pandemic, we were doing workshops online, and we did a workshop that was so fun called a city maker, where we would have a professional artist there bringing the kids ideas to life,
Wow.
and we would say, we're going to invent a city, and we would ask them what makes up a city. Like, so we would talk about community, we would talk about different neighborhoods and different things, and it was this really wonderful thing of like, in the stories as well, but in particular, it was very prevalent in the city maker, was we're going to build our own world. And a lot of it would be like Candyland. It would be like, it's just going to be Candyland. But a lot of it would, but we would get into interesting stuff where it would be like, what do we do with the trash? Like, what these two people want, this group of people want this, and this group of people want this. What are we going to do about it? And again, you're using metaphor, because the gulf between our world and these worlds would usually, sometimes they'd be like, can there be COVID? And we'd be like, no, there's no COVID.
COVID's
But
not allowed in this city.
oh yeah, COVID was not allowed. That's something as part of those workshops. But it was like, I think that's I think, yeah, as you're saying, people, everything's so polarized. It's so easy to get into a fight with somebody about all of these issues that people have very strong opinions on. But there is this trick that you can do when you start to employ metaphor, where you can create something that says, what if the world was different? And you
Yeah.
can do it. And again, like, creativity and like beautiful artwork, it's not, there's no uh I want to say, like, it's sort of transcends, partisanship, political partisanship. And it's like, there are certain, it can evoke strong feelings and values, and help us realize Man, I feel like this is so cheesy to say, but I guess it's true. Like I feel like this is, but I think it can evoke things that in the metaphor of it we can agree on. If you
Yeah.
move that into a real life situation, people might say, "Well, I don't like that, and I don't agree with you on this." But as soon as you propose that same value in a film or in a story, all of a sudden people go, "Yes, of course, that's what we want as human beings."
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's like our values are not at the core of it. I think values are not political, and yet somehow the world has made everything seem political, and it's turned everybody into having like a team. It's like everything feels like a sporting event where it's like, well, I'm on this team, so I have to go with this. And it's like, well, I think if you really got to the heart of people's values and the things that are important to them, we'd all land somewhere in the middle together. Like I think a
Yeah.
lot of people have a lot more in common than the political parties sort of let us believe that we do, and um I don't know what the answer to that is, because it's not, being moderate is not like clickbait. It's not exciting. It's not, it just isn't, and so it's like, how do you make balance cool and exciting?
I hope there's a way. I don't know. I hope there's a way.
Yeah. There was
Man.
one last thing I really was moved by that I thought was well, I mean, there's a million things I was moved by. I could talk to you for like 7 hours, but um I noticed, I made this note around page 73. I was like, there's a wonderful expressing of like masculine emotionality
Mm,
in this
mhm,
story. And again, not in like an over the top heavy-handed way. It's just there, but it's like the things that both Greg and Charlie go through, and stuff with Errol, the sort of
mhm,
father figure and all these things. It's like there was something so wonderful about like just being able to experience these male characters who were emotional, but not in a way that was like,
mhm,
I don't know, just they just wasn't trying to make a point. Do you know what I mean? Like it just felt like there was a balance to the emotionality of the characters. There was this sort of like I think in the old days we felt like these masculine characters weren't like allowed to be emotional, and now we're like, well, men need to be emotional, and how do we teach them that? And there just seems to be a lot of like, again, politics around
mhm.
masculinity right now, and which understandably so. But there was something really beautiful about that, and even that you had like one of the female characters, again, my favorite, I can't even pronounce it, Williambury woman,
Artemis
Artemis, my
love that.
buddy Artemis.
Yeah.
But she has that great, I'm gonna see if I can find it actually. I can't, by the way, I can't wait to get the real book, because this is my
Oh
this is
yeah.
my copy. It's just
Oh
like
wow.
I
Fantastic.
I have an aggressive relationship with what I read, clearly.
Great.
Um,
Nice.
but
I love that.
she's a great rant on page 82. Let me just find it. I
Sure.
I I was like, oh God, what a great um so this character, because her name was Artemis, just for anyone listening, is sort of mistaken as being a man, and then Charlie realizes is a woman.
Mm,
And so she's saying to Charlie, if my work comes across as masculine, it is precisely because my primary task has been to find God in the land. Mother Earth as God is a particularly feminine notion, but specific encounters with the divine in nature, for me at least, usually involve some sort of volcano or a mountain or an iceberg. In short, yes, some sort of naturally occurring monolithic cock. I'm sure there are a number of feminist artist critics out there who would take issue with my depiction of the divine, but it's simply how I've always felt. It's also coherent with the popular idea that God is a dick.
Oh
I laughed
man, making myself laugh
so
again.
hard. I laughed so hard when I read that, because I just thought it is true. Like we do always think of like, I don't know, of nature as this feminine, entity. And yet there are very masculine part. Again, it's balance, right?
Mm,
There is this
yeah.
feminine part of nature, and there's a very masculine part of nature. And it's not all one or all the other. And I don't know. I thought it was such a funny way to sum up all of it. And I felt like you could just sort of see the whole earth and all the, like the fluidity of the water, but then like these
Yeah.
volcanoes and like the eruption of the volcanoes, and like, and then at the end of the day, sort of just being like, Yeah, I mean, all these weird things that the religions are, the gods we've been invented and the religions have asked of people, like, God is kind of a dick in some of those
Yeah,
religions, It's just like,
yeah,
oh my gosh. So anyway,
yeah,
I really enjoyed that there was that like kind of beautiful balance and like an effortless expression of masculine emotionality, which I feel like is such a great thing again for the world. It's like that thing of having to dream it up for people to imagine what that could look like, and it didn't feel like, oh, okay, we're having a big lesson in toxic masculinity here. It was like,
right,
oh no,
yeah.
we're just experiencing like humans, whether they're male or female or however they identify, having emotional experiences and expressing them honestly. And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that that was I think if I was, I think that was actually something, part of the metaphors that we were discussing earlier. I think those, like, those were really interesting that they, I saw them more retroactively. But I think, again, because I was going through a really big shift in my own life at the time when I was doing the rough draft of this, of, leaving this band that I had been playing in, which was very much the role that I had identified in all those years, and then moving and then having to kind of figure out, what am I doing now and who am I and what is this all about. I think I was very lucky because there was a lot of rich material that surfaced just through my own, what I was going through personally. And again, it's not a particularly personal novel. Like, there's not too much in there of
Hmm.
my own sort of autobiographical experience, but certainly, the way that Greg and Charlie talk to each other and that exploration of male emotion, that was something where I was like, I'm going to use my characters a little bit to work through some of the stuff that I'm trying to work through, and I was doing dream therapy, and I was kind of trying to work out a lot of stuff. And again, like, I have a lot of, I'm very lucky. I have a lot of very beautiful friendships, and a lot of my friends happen to be, like, hetero millennial dudes and with baggage, and we're all trying to figure it out. And I am very lucky because I get to have a lot of the kinds of conversations that Charlie and Greg have with each other, where it's guys who are trying to kind of get into their emotions a little bit more and figure out what the hell's going on. And I think I wanted to say one more thing about that. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about that is that I think, again, having this beautiful, flowy, compassionate deep sea feline symbol at the center of the novel. It is this very beautiful, divine, feminine symbol. And I think in some ways and I might be screwing this up somehow, but I think the pelican would be more sort of a masculine, energy or something. But I do think, you said something really interesting about, this kind of this concept that has become very prevalent in our culture of toxic masculinity. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and I think that it's good to, to understand what that is, and how that
100%.
might be,
Yes. Yeah.
a part of your behaviors, and trying to sort of course correct on that. But I have found it interesting, and I literally was talking to my current therapist about this last week, of saying, I feel like I was so obsessed for a while of, like, I'm trying to, like, get rid of my toxic masculinity and embrace this, divine femininity. But I think what's interesting now is that it is starting to come back around, where it is like embracing the idea of a healthy masculinity. And again, and this is a sweet tie-in, talking about making balance cool. Like, that's it, right? It's like,
Right.
that's a beautiful thing. Like, it's a beautiful thing to find whatever is your authentic version of yourself, whatever the balance is of, like, I have all of these certain facets and aspects of myself that embody, a feminine energy, and I have all these facets and aspects of myself that embody, like, a divine masculinity. And it's the work of uncovering that and figuring out, like, where do you sit, on that spectrum, and how can you kind of, find that balance. And there's been a lot of that psychic downward pressure and these really difficult sort of cultural influences that have got us, quite turned around and confused. So it's beautiful to see people starting to kind of break through those constructs and find, that balance, that
Yeah. Balance, and in the balance for any given person is completely different. And that, I think that's what's also amazing, is that we're embracing the idea that it's not the same for any two people, that everyone's going to have a different sort of ratio of balance that feels like that feels right for them. Um, well, anyway, I don't want to keep you forever, but thank you. I'm just so grateful that you took the time to do this. And it's been really, really fun to talk to you about this. And I this is a book that I will read again. And I know I will be blown away by how much I missed the first time. It's really spectacular. I can't believe it's your first novel. I can't wait for the world to have access to it and be able to read it and digest it. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's really, really exciting. So I'm just really grateful that you took the time to talk to us about it.
Wow, yeah. I mean, thank you so much for saying that. I think, yeah, this is the first interview that I've done for the book. So I'm very grateful that yeah, this was such a rich, meaty conversation, and I'm just yeah, thank you so much for your kind words.
Well, and I look forward to the next novel.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
I'm excited. I'm excited. All right. Let me,